Right, Afua, it's fantastic that you've got time to meet with us today, and it's sort of in a way strange to talk to you because in some ways you predicted what was going to happen in Britain when you wrote about British. I can't even pronounce the name
That's
of your
perfect
book.
pronunciation, and as did you. I feel like it's very unusual to be in conversation with someone else who also predicted, albeit in a different context, the kind of political cleavages that we were about to.
Yes, so now that we're here as crystal ball gazers, maybe we should go back to your particular crystal ball gazing. So when you wrote your book, you talked about Britishness being a concept in crisis. I mean, that's putting it in a very professorial way. But I don't know if you can sort of go back and revisit that a little bit.
Well, I would say that is an analysis that I offered from two different contexts. The first was very personal. So
Yes.
I grew up British. I've never had another nationality or a different national identity. And throughout my life, I've experienced two things. One was people constantly questioning me as to where I was from. And not in a sinister or malevolent way, out of curiosity, but what it revealed to me. And when I mean constantly, I mean almost every day. And when I said I was British, not accepting that as response and saying, yes, but where are you really from? Where are you originally from? And what that taught me from very early on in my childhood was that people perceived Britishness as a white identity. So that if you didn't conform to that imagined whiteness, then you were really from somewhere else, and that was an explanation you could offer. And one of the other reasons I came to that conclusion was that over time I discovered that many of the white people in my life have fascinating immigration stories. I myself have a grandfather who escaped Nazi Germany as a Jewish refugee. Many other white friends with Celtic or Mediterranean or Huguenot heritage who weren't being asked where they're from or to tell their story. So I very much perceived that as something that people looked at you as visibly other and felt that you weren't really Britishness, your Britishness was somehow conditional. And then the second part of that sense that I personally engaged with was that when I began to, as a professional, offer a critique of Britishness, I was told that I should be more grateful to be here and that if I didn't like it here, I should leave. And that's something that people have seen me be asked live on national television. And again, I think that really revealed to me this subconscious perception that if you are not white, Britishness is a privilege that you should be grateful for, that you should be grateful for your own nationality in a way that a white British person would never be expected to be, and also that your presence here is somehow conditional on good behaviour, on conforming to the idea of a good immigrant. And that personal experience really led me to conclude that there were a whole set of ideologies underpinning the idea of what Britishness was, and that those ideologies were very hostile to people who didn't conform to what people felt was the indigenous, true British person. And really the second thing that led me to my sense that there was a crisis of Britishness was living in Ghana in the early 2010s, so 2011, 2012, when Britain was still suffering very much from the credit crisis, the financial crisis. And Ghana then had the fastest growing economy in the world. It was 15% GDP growth a year. Now, when many black British people had moved to Ghana, and there was something very positive about that, many of them have said, as a black person, I want to live on the African continent, contribute to an African country that is booming. On the other hand, there were very many young British graduates, innovators, entrepreneurs who had moved to Ghana because they said, I feel that Britain is closed to me. Even though I'm British, I do not have a sense of opportunity in Britain. I feel that there's only so far I can go. And in a way, they were fleeing Britain because they felt that they would never be accepted in their own country. And that really concerned me, and it made me think, if this idea of what Britishness is excluding a generation of people who should be among its core constituents, then something has gone very wrong in our concept of what Britishness is. And the more I started to probe that, the more I experienced this hostility, that when you ask these questions, when you start to look at the history and the ways in which the narratives of Britishness were created, very much in particular during the imperial era, where this idea of Britain as this Anglo-Saxon race destined to rule over savage peoples in the world, which really was the ideology of empire, that involved a whole construction of what the national identity and the racial content of Britishness was that's never actually been challenged if you look at the 20th century. And when you begin talking about that, instead of people being intellectually curious or receptive, I often experience this very hostile backlash. All of which led me to really diagnose a fragility that British people were not able to withstand a robust or open conversation about what these narratives of identity were. And I really believe that if we can't have these conversations that are existential for British people like me who are trying to make sense of our own role in this country and in the future. If we want Britain to compete in this globalised economy that draws so much on the advantages of diversity, multicultural societies, we can't compete with countries that are doing that successfully if we are hostile towards and fragile about what Britishness actually means. And I predicted that if we don't address these fragilities, they will start to manifest in these political cleavages that could be very self-destructive for Britain. And so while I'm not an expert on referendums in the same way that you are, and I would never claim to have predicted the specific outcome of the Brexit referendum, I did foresee that these questions about identity and belonging and these narratives about who belongs in Britain and what Britain should project, that there was something toxic happening there that if unaddressed could really be a destructive force for Britain's future, and I feel that is exactly what has happened.
And that is still happening, isn't it? That we're sort of trying to push it down in a way. But one of the things that struck me when you were talking about this is that Britain seems to be almost a sort of blood and belonging type of, you know, there is the tribe and so on, which is a little bit like German nationalism traditionally has been, whereas in France, I mean, lots of bad things are happening in France, I'm sure, but France has always said, well, to be French is to believe like liberté, égalité and fraternité, and during the imperial era, there were actually Africans, you know, from Africa, Africans from Africa, but who served as cabinet ministers. Some of the first presidents of many of the African countries had served as fully fledged cabinet ministers in
like
France.
Leopold Senghor and
yes, for example, yes. Do you think there is a difference, because Britain was always that sort of paternalistic kind of like white man's burden, which is both sexist and racist, and then the French one, even, I mean, not saying that the French one is a good one. Do you think that the legacy of that, the legacy of British nationalism as being if you're not part of the tribe, if you're not born here, you can't be British. Whereas in France, anybody really can be French if they, like Sarkozy was Hungarian, for just take a recent example.
I do think there's a difference, and I think it is one of, you know, there's a quote by Salman Rushdie, the problem with the British is that they don't know their history because so much of it happened overseas, which is a quote I often come back to and I think is very perceptive. And I think that one of the differences between France and Britain is that France had an idea of its empire that created an assimilationist ideology, which was imperfectly enacted and also problematic. But there was this idea that a black African born in Senegal could be French. The reason it's problematic is that it was still a white supremacist ideology. If you set aside your African traditions and culture and behave enough like a true Frenchman, then you might make it into true civilization and count as French. And that is something you very much see in the relationship that the Francophonie has with France, that in Francophone countries in Africa, there is still this aspiration to cultural Frenchness. And there also were large numbers of French settlers in West African countries. So I think that France had a greater awareness of its African colonies and that there was a greater visibility of people from those countries in the French metropolitan system. But what these countries have in common, all European countries which had empires, was that they did all still aspire to or claim these ideals about égalité, fraternité, about human rights and democracy, but they absolutely didn't implement them. So France said this whilst extorting Haiti for having been the first country to have the audacity to overthrow slavery. France continued to extort Haiti well into the 20th century. France ran a segregationist, racist system in its African colonies whilst claiming to espouse these values. And although it looks different in Germany, France, Denmark, Britain, all of these former colonial powers have a history that they have not fully acknowledged. And one thing I find interesting about Germany, for example, is that Germany is often held up as a nation that has really done some very difficult and important introspective work on its past. Obviously, the Nazi era has led to a national consensus about the importance of knowing your history and avoiding repeating mistakes, which I think is crucial and a valuable lesson. But at the same time, Germany has done very little to acknowledge the atrocities it carried out in its empire in Africa. You know, committed the first genocide of the 20th century in Namibia, in some cases annihilating half of the population. Really serious wrongs that were perpetuated for decades that most Germans still don't know about. And I think that what really strikes me when I look at the patterns in different European countries is the the consistency with which all European nations have ducked any real honest analysis of the ideological underpinnings of their empire and the legacy of that today, because there has never been a moment where that ideology has been disowned. So my mother was born in a colony in Ghana, which was then the Gold Coast, where children were told that the best thing that could happen to them was that they could behave more like white British people. They were told their heritage, their religions, their language, their culture was savage, and that they should speak English, practice Christianity, and behave like white British people. And that is recent living memory. You know, this is the person who raised me was told these things growing up. And many of people of my generation have parents who had that conditioning. And when Britain lost its empire in Africa and Asia, it wasn't with a renunciation of those values. It quietly morphed into the Commonwealth of something we're now all told we should celebrate. So for me, there's never been a moment where we can actually look at what the impact of those ideas was and the continuity, because you lose an empire, the formal boundaries change, sovereignty shifts, but the ideology underpinning it, which was deliberately constructed to make colonized people believe that they were inferior and that superiority came from British culture and civilization, that ideology has never been undone. And I don't think that's something that we have been honest about. And yet, and worse still, when you want to talk about it, you have a government, you have political leaders who tell you that we should be proud of the empire. And that's all there is to say about it.
Yes.
That's problematic.
Yes. See, just I just do a little bit of a detour, because I was in, I think the very first African American to get a PhD from Harvard was a guy called W.E.B. Du Bois, yeah. I want to call him Du Bois, but Du Bois. And he wrote a wonderful book called The Soul of Black Folks, which has got little vignettes of music, and it's probably the most creative sociology treatise ever. But in that book, he also talks about Shakespeare. I think at some stage, I'm paraphrasing now, where he says, I want to be part of the Western civilization, because the Western civilization at its best is one which is open and critical and self-reflective. So I wonder just if you could reflect on that, because whenever I've sort of often said that, and I say, well, that was just because he was trying to be more white than white, and he studied in Germany. This idea that Western civilization can actually be, you know, the civilization of critical rationalism and not just the sort of inward looking. So yeah, I'm just sort of.
Well, it's a nice idea, and it's actually instructive that W.E. Du Bois radically changed his views as he got older, and he actually moved to Ghana and died there, and renounced his earlier Eurocentricity in many ways. I think that we've all been, I speak for myself and other Black British people, African Americans, many people in African and Caribbean countries, we have been raised with the European canon, with European political and social philosophical values, and many of them at face value are attractive, very attractive. I read PPE, I studied Locke, Hume, Kant, and actually was very jaded when I learned in my 30s how many of these Enlightenment thinkers had actually ploughed their intellectual productivity into justifying slavery through theories of pseudoscientific racism. And I think this is the problem with so much of what we've been told is European civilization, is that you can't take it apart from its context. So these lofty ideals were never applied to Black people. If you look at the American Declaration, or you look at France after the Revolution, they've always existed in theory, but they've never been allowed to apply to people who are not white. And so it's very difficult to separate European ideas of civilization from European ideas about racism. There are no examples of European country that has created those ideas and not perpetrated racism at the same time. And that's why I think it's important to understand the slave trade and the colonial era, because that's where we see that juxtaposition and people being able to reconcile this intellectual creativity could be compatible with forms of racism that we now universally abhor. Nobody defends the transatlantic slave trade, but people like to say that it's completely separate from all of the Enlightenment output. And they were intrinsically linked. So I would love to see an example of a European civilization that isn't grounded in racism and the exploitation, and not just slavery, but the destruction of land, culture. Everywhere we see Europeans having colonized and settled other countries and continents, we see the same patterns of environmental destruction that's contributed to the climate crisis we had to have today in profound ways. Racism and the oppression or destruction of indigenous culture. So I don't know what European culture looks like separate from those atrocities, because they've always happened together.
But then, I suppose a bit like Gandhi was asked the same question. He says, "What do you think of Western civilizations?" I think it would have been a good idea.
It would be a good idea.
Yeah, I think even maybe it made it more conditional. But anyway, but is it still a good idea? Because what do we do then? Because what's the alternative? Or what do we do? I mean, Jefferson wrote nicely, and then he had slaves and other people. What do we do about the model of society which is founded upon the Enlightenment ideas? Do we need to get rid of the Enlightenment and move on? Because at the moment we have sort of like people who are liberal, Guardian reading types like myself, and then we've got the sort of Nigel Farage types. And then those people like me always claim not to be racist at all, and we probably have things that I would say that would be inadvertently racist because the way I was brought up and so on. But what kind of model would we then use to face up to our history, if not the Kant and the Locke and the Hume and all of that?
Well, I'm not saying that we should destroy hundreds of years of ideas.
So how do we reform
but
it?
I think that the first step is acknowledging the problem. And so, what's very frustrating about many of these discussions is that instead of actually having this conversation, which is really interesting, I spend a lot of my time having to argue that there is even anything wrong with the last 400 years of history, and that these Enlightenment ideas have been used to justify, in a very intrinsic way, racism. And so I think that acknowledging that there is a problem there is it sounds trite, but it's actually very profound and significant first step. I'm not advocating the destruction of history, the destruction of intellectual ideas. I think, though, that there are two things, and coming back to Du Bois, whenever black people say that they really aspire to Shakespeare or Rousseau, I always wonder how much African intellectual creativity they're familiar with, because we've all been raised in systems that have erased that. So I certainly grew up thinking that political theory and philosophy and scientific invention was the monopoly of white people, because there was not a single black inventor or political theorist or philosopher on any of the curricula I ever studied. And that's all been self-education I've done since leaving formal education. So how can you make an informed choice about which values you relate to or aspire to if you only know one set? And I think that once you start to actually democratize the space and make it a marketplace of ideas that you can engage with on an equal footing, then you start to have a very different conversation. And it's not to say I don't want anything to do with European thinking or the Enlightenment. It's just to say I would also like to know what other ideas people have come up with, so that we can do what you would do if you had a blank slate, which is start to construct a system of values and ideology that is fit for purpose in the society that you live in and the values that you aspire to. And we can't do that while we continue to systematically try to downgrade anything that comes from thinkers who aren't white. And that is unfortunately literally what's still happening. If you look at the whole battle at the moment over the curriculum, this sense that if you do anything to change the curriculum, you're demonizing white people, which is incredibly intellectually and historically illiterate as a response to that claim. But I think that we all understand the idea of merit, of looking at ideas on merit, but we've never experienced it because it has been a centuries long-term intervention in favour of white male thinkers. White women haven't been included, let alone people of colour. So I would like to see what kind of ideas we would support if we had access to them.
So in another way, I've always been pushing for my children to read Chinua Achebe and things like that, and big writers like that. So if there could be a bit more like that, that would be a step, I suppose.
Yes, and something that fascinates me when I read African political theory is how much a group of young Africans in the mid-20th century changed the world through their ideas. And these were philosophers and political theorists, and they invented an idea of Pan-Africanism and a very specific roadmap for dismantling the empires in Africa that actually worked. They didn't just philosophize, they then enacted and led and created, and it's a remarkable thing to see. And that wasn't a perfect project, and that the independence movement in Africa, for example, ended in what many of them predicted, which was forms of neocolonialism. Doesn't detract from the value of the ideas that they had. And you know, you replicate that over decades. I was reading a book from 1890s Sierra Leone recently, which was remarkable. I'm still discovering so many of these tracts, theses, ideas, papers, and I think that we would all be vastly enriched from reading them. And it might sound really dramatic to say this, but the culture of white supremacy is has really paralyzed people from being open to ideas that could really enrich their thinking. And that's not the fault of any one individual. We've all been educated with a system that biases us towards the canon as we know it. And I think that is a disservice to us all. And I especially feel that we are committing an act of neglect towards young people when we continue to miseducate them, knowing that we could do a much better job of giving them the tools to work out how we can create a new society. Because it's not just race, you know, when you look at our education system, it's designed to create factory workers, which made sense during the Industrial Revolution. It's not designed to create people that can work in the digital economy that we have now. And if you ask government leaders what their plan for changing the education system so that it's fit for purpose in a world where 30 to 40% of professional jobs won't exist in the next 20 to 30 years. I mean, it's that radical a change that we're heading towards. There is no plan.
Or one could also be cynical and be like sort of Foucault and say, well, the plan is actually to discipline people rather than to teach them anything.
At least that would be a plan if someone were to admit it openly, which they don't. So I think that we've been dumbed down in so many ways, and we don't have an approach where we look at the challenges of the future and we look at the society we're in without the shackles of racism and discrimination, and accept that we are a society, and we work out how we can create a system of education, of values, of legislation, where we can innovate our culture so that it works for us. And what's just so bizarre to me is that when you try and have that conversation, you get met with this hysterical response by the gatekeepers of the status quo, who feel very threatened that any change might diminish the power that they have enjoyed for so long, but I think they also deep down sense is unsustainable, and that's why they fight so hard to preserve it.
Yes, the last stand of the angry white man, as they've called it. But, and one of the sort of the angry white men who came out, I mean, several angry white men.
I could list a few.
You can have a list, yeah. We have a black book here, and the pen, you can start now. But one of the things that one of the things that was interesting about what you said back in the day in your book, not so long ago, was that a number of people are literally put on the pedestal who have had slaves, who are opposed to abolishing the slave trade, and one of whom was Nelson. And we now have Nelson somewhere high up, I don't know how high up.
I think it's 50 feet.
50 feet, okay. And somebody, I think Roy Strong, who was the Queen's art historian, said no, we can't tear. I mean, I don't think you suggested we should tear them down.
I didn't.
No, and of course, which in itself is interesting. That actually, maybe first of all reflect on that. But do you think that if you just sort of tweet, as it were, not in Twitter way, but tweet a little bit, it was like an aside, and then they all rounded you, and they sort of come down like a ton of bricks. Is that a thing that you sort of feel is consistent if you are of sort of not white male British, then they just all go for you and they go for below the belt basically?
It was remarkable. I wrote a Guardian column which was when the whole question of Confederate statues in the US was really dominating the news cycle, and there were protests, protests, an anti-racist protester was killed protesting against a Confederate statue. And I noticed many British people saying, gosh, terrible what's happening in America, it's so wonderful we don't have any of those problems of racism here. And I wrote a column in The Guardian looking at our statues and suggesting that we also have statues that embody past ideas of white supremacy, and that Nelson was an example of that. And far from arguing that his statue should be destroyed, I was arguing that we should engage with it in a more complete way, where we actually understand the history of not just Nelson, but it's not a coincidence that really our most famous naval hero, as people see him, spent almost his entire career in the Caribbean, because the Caribbean was of huge strategic importance to Britain, because at the time more than half of British GDP came from slave-produced sugar in the Caribbean. And these are all things that people have conveniently forgotten. And so this isn't to demonise one person. This is to say this is a nation that wants to remember Trafalgar in a glorious way, but forget that that was also a global economy in which British-owned slaves on British-owned plantations provided a bulk of our GDP for years, decades, centuries. So you can't have one without the other, and I've always found that inconsistency incredibly dishonest. So when I wanted to talk about the fact that Nelson was part of a global military strategic system that protected the institution of slavery and the economic output of slavery, and that he also personally was comfortable with that system, and he married into it, and he was friends with powerful plantation owners, and he opposed abolitionists. All of which was based on historically agreed facts. Nobody questioned the facts, but what I was met with was this absolutely remarkable hostile response from people who said, you just can't say that because he's a hero and it's Trafalgar and it's Britishness, and without him we would have lost to the French. And I wasn't contesting any of his naval victories or accomplishments. I was simply saying, if you ignore how he located himself in the question of slavery, then you deprive yourself of understanding this entire aspect, arguably existential aspect of Britain's economic and political past. And I was not only personally attacked, I was on the front pages of tabloids who had a picture of me saying, meet the woman who wants to destroy Britain's history. And you see this picture of a black face and destroy Britain's history in a very right-wing tabloid. And the messaging is very clear, and it was actually scary because I had death threats, people very personally attacking me, saying I should be hanged, they should bring back the death penalty. And I actually, stepping aside from the kind of actual fear of that kind of reaction, I just found it really fascinating that when you present someone with facts which nobody disagrees with, they respond by attacking you and saying that you shouldn't say these things. And it reminded me of an interview I did with an Oxford professor who told me that she had wanted to do her thesis on the Churchill's role in the Bengal famine, and had been told by her peers that that would destroy her career at Oxford and it would not be wise. And even I naively thought that at Oxford there was so much value placed on intellectual integrity that you wouldn't be censored just because it's politically inconvenient to research a subject that is, again, historically documented. And I just, again, saw that fragility, that people don't want to hear the truth. And what they're really saying is, I'm not interested in the facts. I'm interested in this narrative that makes me feel proud of my imagined past. And I don't think that's healthy. That's something I expect maybe of a dictatorship, of a country that has access to propaganda rather than history. And I was genuinely surprised to find it such a strong instinct in Britain, not just among not particularly well-educated people who attack me on social media, but respected historians, government figures, people with huge platforms who told me, you can't say that. I need to believe that Britain has always been right and has always won and is inherently victorious. And any narrative that was not really compatible with that was kind of quietly ignored or swept away. So instead of talking about the slave trade, Britain celebrates abolition with great pomp and fanfare, huge celebrations commemorating Wilberforce, nobody actually acknowledging the 3 centuries of what happened before that was being abolished, but it was all about Britain was the first to abolish the transatlantic slave trade, which also isn't true. And then it was all this, it was all this benevolent white man who did it, no reference to the African activists who played a huge role in achieving the abolition of the slave trade. So whichever way you look at it, it was just incredibly selective.
So what you're basically arguing for, I'm sorry just to...
Yes, sorry. So I was saying British people are addicted to hearing a version that makes them feel good. History is a celebratory subject. That makes it very difficult to introduce things.
Yes, and it's sort of like the line, I think somebody had said that, glorious or lucky the country that has heroes, but lucky the country that doesn't need them.
Yes.
And I think it's a sort of like the thing about Britain at the moment is that we seem to be, and I'd like you to reflect a little bit on that, At the moment, it seems that we're going back to the sort of like we need to have a hero. We need to sort of. I mean, there are even people who talk about the post-Brexit settlement as Empire Mark II, and it seems to be coming back with a vengeance. A lot of things are actually getting worse. We've had more stop and search, more racial profiling, even if it's not official, and then we have all these sentiments. So, do you think that now we're having this conversation, things are actually getting worse?
I do think things are getting worse. I think Britain is committing a huge act of economic and political self-harm through a Brexit which is really based on a need to feed people's desire to feel good about their Britishness. And in a time when these identities are shifting due to global and structural change, but also due to the changing demographic composition of Britain, Britain's decline on the world stage, I think that it's become a short-term, lazy way of making voters feel good to offer them this reinvention that actually will have a huge cost, but that in the short term can be sold as something that solves the problem of not feeling so proud about Britain anymore. And I think that it's just creating a whole new problem. If during the imperial period people were told that Britain was glorious and inherently superior and that's why it was okay to subjugate and annihilate and conquer other peoples and land around the world. Now we're creating a whole new narrative that Britain deserves favourable trading terms and Britain deserves to be separate and Britain deserves to be exceptionalist, and that's now a new set of false narratives that someone's later going to have to undo. So that's depressing. Well, we would like us to be taking a step at least in the right direction. I feel we're taking several steps back. On the other hand, and I think so many nations are going through something like this, things are becoming so bad. And I also include in that, to me, having political leaders who are openly racist and divisive in ways that I haven't experienced during my lifetime. Boris Johnson has made so many overtly racist statements in his career as a journalist, as a politician. I've written about them so many times. He wrote them. It's not even someone catching him off guard, off the record, on a hidden camera. These are things he wrote and published himself. And it's quite clear that he and his government, his ministers have been incredibly dismissive about Black Lives Matter. They're now saying that people who do anti-racism work are breaking the law. It's so much more serious than actually anything I could have imagined in the past. It almost makes you feel nostalgic for the days of Theresa May, where she at least felt guilty about deporting Black British people in the Windrush scandal, which was also one of the most horrendous things that's happened in my lifetime. But at least there was an acknowledgement that that was wrong, whereas all these wrongs are now being regularly perpetrated, and it's almost as if the government is trying to normalise them so that the electorate can feel that it's all right for them to also be racist and revert to these very reductive, bigoted mindsets. And I think people are experiencing that in their daily lives. I certainly have found people saying things to me I don't think they would have felt emboldened to say out loud in the past, but now it's okay because it's being modelled by our leaders. It's a really scary time, but what I was going to say is that I think the other side is that it's triggering a backlash that has woken people up. And so if in the past, I was 16 when Tony Blair won the 1997 election, that was my kind of political coming of age, and I remember then for the next 10 years feeling a little bit disillusioned, that it felt very difficult to discern the difference between left and right. Everything was occupying this centre ground, kind of public-private partnerships and the language of human rights, but yet inequality getting worse. And now I think all the complacency that things have kind of just amalgamated to the middle has dissipated. And the same is true of America under Obama. People wanted to believe that racism had gone away, and now nobody is arguing that racism has gone away. I think they're either for it or against it. Yes. And people have really snapped out of this complacency and realised that if you want to achieve progress, you have to work for it. You can't just sit back and expect it to happen. So whilst I feel very pessimistic about our political leadership, I feel very optimistic about the conversations I'm hearing in the real world. I think young people are instinctively interested in progress and equality. I think they're better educated despite our curriculum not serving them. They're self-educating. I think if you look at the books that are selling out now, there are so many voices. It's no longer just a single book about the Black British experience once every decade. There are numerous voices and they are actually informing the conversation. So I think the gulf between those who are trying to protect the status quo and those who want to achieve progress is wider than ever. But at least there is a sense of a struggle that needs to be undertaken. And I personally take energy from being part of it, even though I wish some of the things we were fighting for were long won, because it really does feel regressive at the same time.
Brilliant.